Good afternoon. You can see how committed I was to the title because the actual title for the presentation is different from the one that I submitted. Before I start, I must say I'm terribly embarrassed because I have this PowerPoint and I don't have any of the fancy pictures that everyone else has had. So actually you should send me off to the other room and make me redo it, but I won't. I chose to write or to bring this subject to you because it's something that I've been interested in for quite a while. The organization that I'm currently with, the Asia Pacific Higher Education Research Partnership, grew out of a program at the East-West Center, which was called the International Forum for Education 2020, which started at the turn of the century. Had a very simple but wonderfully complex problematic, and that problematic was that the world was changing more rapidly than higher education, and that we should probably figure out some ways to try to deal with that. And so that project has been going on for quite a while. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is something that we refer to as the alignment dilemma, and I'll say what I mean by that. It came upon me as a significant problem in all of education, but specifically in higher education, about 10 years ago when I listened to a speech by the President of India who was bemoaning the fact that India had just graduated something like 5.5 million from its universities, and by his estimate, perhaps no more than 1 million of them were prepared to enter the economy. At that time, Indian higher education was still educating people for the British civil service, which turned out to be not very effective. So I have combined this interest in the alignment dilemma with a persistent and continuing interest that I also have in globalization. And not to put too complex a face on it, but the fact that globalization proceeds in a continuing and increasingly complex way, and such that I think that we have to develop new ways of thinking about that very complexity in and of itself. I'm quite a fan of the British geographer David Harvey, who has talked about globalization in the context of postmodernization. And he looks at change by commenting on the nature and the rate of change itself has changed. So I submit to you, if you want to have an interesting intellectual exercise for yourself, think about that for 3 or 4 days and see where it gets you. One of the things that I think is manifestly true, however, and I'll come back to this later, is that the rate of change has increased, and it's increased dramatically. And we all have various metrics for that in our own work. One of the ones that I find myself coming back to and referring to again and again is the degree to which information in given fields compounds. And in the United States, there's a metric that we use familiarly now, that an engineering student, a student entering electrical engineering, which is a 4-year course in most American universities, by the time he finishes that 4-year course, 50% of what he will have learned at the information level is obsolete. So this creates something that I think is above and beyond what we have seen before in certainly in higher education in any of our countries. And so it's that I wish to talk to this afternoon, and to put it in the context of some things that I call global imperatives. I put these on the screen just so that we can get some sense of how complex and dynamic and continuous the processes of global change are. So if we just look at those 8 things, and once again put them in our head, but put them in motion. Okay, so now we've got 8 things in motion, and they're not going to go around in motion as if they were in a circle. They're going to go around in motion in 360-degree manners, right? As if they're interacting with spheres. And so all of these things interact with each other in manifestly complex and unpredictable ways. One of the ways that we stay sane is to ignore that and pick up a piece of it and focus on that piece and try to sort that out. That's exactly what I want to talk about this afternoon, because I want to argue that that perhaps doesn't work so well anymore. I want you to focus for just a moment on this issue, which is one that we talk a great deal about when we talk about skill acquisition. The impacts of new technologies, not only on globalization, but society itself. And so we speak familiarly now about the information society, the knowledge society, et cetera, again, as if we knew what that meant. And my proposition is that often we don't. And that we have a sense, for example, in economic development, that innovation is not only good, but it's necessary. So if we're having a conversation in an American university, for example, about innovation, no one asks the question, is there bad innovation? But of course there is. And so one of the questions that economists and social economists are starting to ask is, all of this press which is going on in higher education, in the information society, in the knowledge society, towards innovation, what's the cost of that? Because often we are displacing things that are simply old because of the fact that they exist, without commenting on whether that's a valuable displacement or not. But anyway, if we had more time, we could look at the interaction of these things with each other, and I want to suggest that they're simply interesting. Some of the other things that have to be put in the equation when we talk about globalization that go well with the things on the other side is the population equation, which all of us are familiar with. There's not a person in this room who's not. But I don't think there's a person in this room who occupies themselves on a daily basis with that question. We came close to it this morning when we're talking about global agriculture and how we're going to feed people and where the water is going to come from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Jiminy, 228,000 people a day is quite a lot. So what are the tipping points? And one of the places that I think it's interesting to think about tipping points are urban areas, because now we live on an urban planet. We became an urban planet in 2000, and if you do the math, it turns out that the amounts of habitable non-urban space that will also provide agriculture for this group of people will be reached, it is argued, by 2045. So we're living in a world which is changing extraordinarily rapidly. I spend most of my time thinking about this one, which is the increase in the distribution of wealth in the world. There are some people who want to argue now that the maldistribution of wealth in the world is at the greatest level that it's been since the early portion of the 19th century, which is rather extraordinary. One of the ways that I think it's possible to point out the force of novelty which is operating throughout the global system is to look at this last bullet. The effect of innovation and novelty include the increasing role played by global finance. Global finance almost brought the world to its knees in 2007. We came very close. Governments finally realized what was going on and started to pull that together. But one of the interesting things, and I'm going to show you this chart in just a minute, is the current global derivative obligation in the world is estimated to be $680 trillion. That's 3 times the global wealth of the world. So here we've created a financial system which has a potential obligation of 3 times the global wealth of the world, and we're walking around as if somehow that's not consequential. U.S. derivatives grew in 15 years from 0 to $182 trillion. So this is what that looks like when you put it on a map. And you can see that that curve is rather extraordinary. I don't want to have a conversation here about whether derivatives are good or bad or whatever. I simply put the slide in there to suggest to us that there are dimensions of interactive change going on in the world to which we want to reference education towards that we tend often to ignore simply because it's convenient. So these are what I think are some of the educational impacts. All of these dynamics find themselves at levels that struggle to produce graduates with skills appropriate to economic opportunities that exist within relevant employment markets, both domestic and abroad. Higher education faces a number of these challenges simultaneously. The need to provide access to ensure relevant capacity, accomplishing both of these goals at acceptable level of quality, needing to be adaptive within constantly and increasing changing ecologies, to be relevant and competitive with socially acceptable financial levels and limits, etc. So I suggest that that's a rather formidable list of issues. And that brings us to what I call the alignment issues. And the argument simply is that higher education is out of alignment with the signals that are generated by the rest of society, by the rest of globalization, by the global financial system. And the alignment issue arises not a little bit from the degree to which all national economies are impacted by these dimensions of globalization that I've hinted at before. As a result, even in the best of circumstances, higher education could or would be slow to react to economic and social signals originating outside its conventional decision framework. Or, how many of you have seen the video, Did You Know? If you haven't, I suggest that you go on the internet this evening and watch it. It's sometimes called Shift Happens. It's become so popular that now there are about 45 different versions of it. All of them are entertaining. But they try to make the point that I started with, the fact that the world is changing more rapidly than education. And most of us, one of the ways to say this that makes all of us feel terribly stupid is to say, what we know about education is what we learn, by and large, by going through the education system, and much of that education system is no longer relevant to the problems that higher education is trying to face, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where it gets. But in Did You Know, it puts it in this charming way. Many of today's majors didn't exist 10 years ago, and we're currently preparing students for jobs and technologies that don't yet exist in order to solve problems that we don't even know are problems yet. So that's depressing, and if you had any sense of self-responsibility at all, you'd start shouting and throwing things and asking me to go away and whatever. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to suggest rather three things about alignment. First of all, it's not a problem. It's a dilemma or a predicament. Now, what's the difference between a problem and a dilemma and a predicament? If you have a problem, the issue is finding the resources and the intellectual capability to solve the problem. And then once you have the solution to the problem, you create the necessary things to solve the problem. A dilemma or a predicament tend to exist by situations which are constantly changing and reoccurring. So any solution that we create for the dilemma that exists, that we treat as a problem, is likely to be undone quickly by virtue of the fact that the situation is changing again. So my suggestion is that this is happening all the time in our economies, and it happens that higher education is constantly being put in a situation which is in a state of a constant predicament. So how do we deal with that? And what I'd like to do is to take the rest of this conversation into something that helps us to do that. This simply talks out what I've just tried to suggest, is that if we're going to have effective responses, we need to develop systems that existing institutions need to develop more effective ways to anticipate future needs. I've just participated in a project with the Western Association of Schools and Colleges in California that went on for about 2 years that we've called The Changing Ecology of Higher Education. And part of what that project was about was looking at all kinds of aspects of American higher education which seem to be changing and which seem to be changing in the way that ecologies change, the fact that everything is related to everything else, and to try to make some sense out of that. One of the ways that we've tried to make sense out of that is to build into one of the standards now that the Western Association uses for higher education accreditation, that every institution of higher education needs to have a mechanism to do something that we call futuring. And since I only have 5 minutes left, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with that. I've put the reference at the end of this. What I really want to talk about is this. In 2011, the Institute for the Future conducted an exercise to produce a report. And I have a couple of slides in that, which I'm just going to show you briefly. At the end of these slides, you will see the reference for it. And if this interests you at all, I encourage you to go to the internet and look at this report. First of all, because it produces its logic in a way that I can't produce on these slides. But I think it's the most clever, most engaging way that any group of researchers has come to try to deal with what I'm calling the alignment dilemma. First of all, just to very quickly go through this, they do what I do, which is probably why I like what they do. They look at globalization and they say, here are 6 disruptive forces, and these are what they say. Extreme longevity, the rise of smart machines, the computational world, but they talk about these in ways that I find particularly interesting and engaging. Let's just pause for a moment with extreme longevity, because I don't think we have really come to grips with that. This is something which is unique in the history of this world. The people in this world are living longer than they ever have before. We have a higher education system throughout the world which was essentially invented in the 19th century for people who are living 35 years on average less than they are now. So it's rather extraordinary. Here are 3 more things that you've heard, of course, that we've just talked about. But once again, the new media ecology and superstructured organizations come to have a meaning in this context which I think go beyond these simple labels. And once again, I encourage you to think of them. If we simply look at new communication tools that require new media literacies beyond context, I was having a conversation at lunch with one of our colleagues here, and I was talking about how the world is beginning to respond to this phenomena that we call big data. Big data didn't exist as a subject matter for most of us 3 or 4 years ago. It's come into the world as a real thing out of medical science, but increasingly it's being used for other kinds of applications. And I was going through one at lunch that comes to the point of developing individualized education for new learners, or learners in any subject matter, based upon the unique characteristics of their learning styles. And just very quickly, you give a bunch of learners at any level pads, and you conduct the learning endeavor through the pads, and every pad is providing, of course, a data record of how that person learns. And after a while, it's possible to develop a set of algorithms for each individual learner. So if all of us in this room were trying to learn a particular kind of task, with the technology that is coming to bear very, very, very quickly, we would have that capacity. Well, I believe that individual learning, through big data, if in fact it emerges, is going to revolutionize what all of us do in classrooms. So I simply bring that to your attention. So here are the 10 skills that they suggest can come out of this. Sense-making, novel and adaptive thinking, social intelligence, transdisciplinarity, new media literacy. I'll show you the other 5 in just a minute, but I want to point out that they believe that these techniques of learning, or these these frameworks for learning can apply to any level. Can apply to any level. First graders, 12th graders, entry, engineering students, whatever. Here's the other set. Now we've seen many of these, and I ask you simply to go through the thought experiment that if we take all 10 of these and map them across our conventional curricula, how then might our curricula be radically transformed in a relatively new way? And I want to, at the risk of overstaying my time, but there's only one more slide, I want to say that as a person who spent his entire adult life in higher education, much of it as a university administrator, albeit a reluctant university administrator, I have come to the conclusion that one of the most conservative groups in the history of the world is a university faculty. So when I think about how we might revolutionize higher education, dealing with the university faculties that we have, what strikes me about these 10 skills is that I think they have within them, and we don't have time to talk this out, the capacity to get by some of that subject matter conservatism which so dominates our institutions and, by the way, creates most of the politics of our institutions. So anyway, this is where it goes. Here are a couple more. This is the OECD framework. You'll have this PowerPoint so that you can look at it again. This simply is another opportunity to look at this from a slightly different way. When we start looking at what do businesses want, again and again and again, we find that sure they want specific skills, but they want students who somehow know how to work within a problematic group setting. The New York Times last Sunday, Tom Friedman has been interviewing Google executives, asking them what they want from people. And they say, sure, we want bright kids, and sure, we want kids who have skills, but what we want for that person who walks through the door is someone who in their brain has an idea of what that stuff might be used for. And so what do you call that? Do you call that creativity? You know, at Google, they call it someone who knows what they want to use their brain for. So, so be it. Google's got more money than I do. So this is, if you're interested, the Changing Ecology Framework. These are the things that we looked at. The things that we think are radically changing higher education. And here are the four key places that you go to find these resources. And I would particularly, if you had to only look at one, I would look at that. I think if you want to be amused, look at that. If you have more time, you might want to spend some time in the WASP concept papers. So thank you very much.